Good afternoon. On behalf of all of us, this is a hearing entitled Changes to the Heights Act Shaping Washington, D.C. for the Future. The committee will come to order, and I will recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. This hearing is important to the residents of the District of Columbia as well as all Americans who come to the nation's capital. We're here to examine the 100-year-old law that governs building heights in the district and to determine what, emphasis, if any, modifications should be made to it. Passed in 1910 to address public safety concerns, the Heights Act generally limits building heights to the width of the street on which it is located, with a maximum limit of 90 feet in residential areas and 130 feet in commercial ones, with a few exceptions throughout the city. The district was not unique in limiting the size of its structures. However, when other cities eased their laws, D.C. held firm to the limitations. This has helped shape our capital city, but as some have argued, may have also stunted its potential. While significant technological improvements have been made over the years to address turn of the 20th century safety issues, it is vital to this debate that we look at every potential ramification of opening this law. For instance, it is a sad fact that D.C. is a terrorist target. I understand the Secret Service and Capitol Police have had concerns in the past about the height of certain buildings near the White House and Capitol complexes, respectively. Before any modification is considered, the safety concerns of our Federal city must be adequately addressed. In addition, we need to look at the overall economic impact any proposal to raise limits would have on the district. There are obvious potential fiscal benefits to the city and the construction community, but higher buildings could also help make housing more affordable, especially for low-income families, younger residents who seek to make D.C. their adopted home. Finally, I want to be clear, this committee has no desire to turn D.C. into the next New York. Our nation's monuments and memorials will not be overshadowed by condos and co-ops. With that in mind, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and we have a very distinguished panel. We're grateful, all of us, for your presence. We look forward to hearing from you on what may potentially come from this hearing. I want to thank everyone for being with us today, sharing your expertise, and now it is my great pleasure to recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, who will be serving as the ranking member for purposes of this hearing, Ms. Holmes-Norton.
Thank you very much, Chairman Gowdy, and you're right. I love New York, but this is the District of Columbia. I particularly want to thank you for this hearing, though, because it's the first hearing in decades about the Height Act. We know that it sets limits. If you were to hear those dimensions, they would mean a lot to you. And we could not find in the record what they were based on. Perhaps some of the witnesses know. The only basis we can come upon for the present limits really are by adoption from other cities or something to that effect. The record does not show that when these standards were adopted, there were hearings and the like. Now, of course, this was before home rule, but I don't know much about the commissioners, but I imagine that somebody must have sat down to decide about these dimensions. In any case, in over 100 years, we cannot find any evidence that the Height Act has been seriously analyzed. I looked for changes in the Height Act and found that there had been 7 amendments. Most of those seem to have been special exceptions. Only 2 were of general applicability. I also don't know the reasons for those changes, both to residential buildings, one to increase the limit by 5 feet, and the other to permit buildings to have 10 floors rather than 8. I don't know the basis for that, but those were the only changes we could find. Now, we're well aware of the Federal interest in protecting the views of its signature buildings and historic sites. Those, of course, are located in the monumental core. There's little information, however, on the public record concerning the uses and purposes of the Height Act today, apart from that important purpose. we do know this, that the discipline on height of buildings that is embedded in the Height Act seems to flow naturally enough from the original vision of the city, from the L'Enfant Plan, the Macmillan Plan. We have the Height Act to thank for the livable scale of this city that is so prized, and for that matter, for the vistas that give our city its unique place in the world, and that draw visitors and, if I may say so, revenue to the district as well. Something interesting seems to have happened, though, over the years. There seems to have developed a nearly common understanding that our identity as a city is wrapped up in part in the Height Act. That's the only reason I can think of that in my service in the Congress for over 20 years, no one has ever approached my office for changes in the Height Act. The only specific change I know of is one that would call for human occupancy of a space already on the top of buildings. That space is now occupied by mechanical equipment. It's known as the mechanical penthouse. Now, on its face, this change would appear to offer some benefit if you could occupy that space without interrupting the current views or vistas that are so prized. At the same time, certainly for me, I have no information on what the effects of this change would be. I don't even know why the decision was made to place the mechanical equipment on the top of buildings. I'm told elevators get pulled from the bottom up, and therefore it was on the top of buildings. I don't know whether if that space was not used for mechanical equipment but was occupied, whether the mechanical equipment could go elsewhere. I don't know what the cost of that, what it would do to the attractiveness of buildings. In other words, this hearing for me is largely technical. The Height Act is like a symbol. It's discussed, it's even revered. But I don't know many people, expert or not, in this city who know very much about the Height Act or spent any considerable time understanding it. It's very much worth understanding if the identity of your city may be closely aligned with the Height Act. Far more difficult than this single notion of occupying this space that's already allowed on buildings is the notion of whether there should be any further relaxation of the Height Act. That, of course, implicates almost exclusively residential D.C. That is an issue that I would approach with caution. The city would ask itself, does it feel a need for relaxation of the Height Act? It would ask itself, what are the implications, economic implications, planning implications, and particularly, what are the neighborhood by neighborhood implications? The topography of the city is very different. It's hard to imagine that, as with today's Height Act, which is uniform, you could have a change in the Height Act that treated the rest of the city uniformly. As someone who has supported smart growth, I'd be interested to know how the city, which also encourages smart growth, squares smart growth with the existing Height Act constraints. I think that no matter how you view the Height Act, its effect on the city at large would need to bear in mind many factors: the identity of the city, its shape, its history, its future. And my own sense is that if in residential D.C. one wanted to alter the Height Act, one would require extensive, comprehensive studies and hearings involving the full range of actors, from many experts to many residents. That's a very weighty task, beyond, of course, the full measure of this hearing. But I thought it should be raised. In any case, I will be very satisfied if I can feel comfortable with the single notion, the single idea that has been raised of occupying the space that's already allowed at the top of buildings. Mr. Chairman, one resident, the Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner and President of the Historic Anacostia Block Association, has submitted a statement, and I ask that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
I thank today's witnesses and look forward to learning from each of them.
Thank the gentlelady from the District of Columbia. I'd also like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, who is joining us today. And on behalf of all three of us and anyone else who may come, we welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses. Other members who wish to may have 7 days to submit opening statements and extraneous material for the record. I will introduce you from my left to right, your right to left, and I will introduce you en banc, and then you will have 5 minutes for your opening statement, and there should be a light system. Red means stop, yellow, go as fast as you can, and green means go. So it is my pleasure on behalf of all of us to welcome our panel, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name, and you're welcome to correct me. I have 3 sisters, so I'm used to it. Ms. Harriet Tregoning is the Director of the D.C. Office of Planning. Dr. Natwar Gandhi is the Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia. I read recently that Robert Griffin signed a contract for 4 years with the Washington Redskins. I know Bryce Harper was signed by the Nationals. I believe you may also have re-upped for a period of time.
Yes, sir.
It may not have been done with as much fanfare as those two, but ultimately, for the health of the city, yours may well be the most important of all 3 of those. So we congratulate you and welcome you.
Thank you, sir. Very kind of you.
Mr. Marcel Acosta is the Executive Director of the National Capital Planning Commission. Mr. Roger Lewis is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland School of Architecture. Mr. Christopher Collins is Counsel to the District of Columbia Building Industry Association. Ms. Laura Richards is a member of the Board of Trustees and a past Chairman of the Committee of 100 on the Federal City. With that, we welcome all of you, and I will, pursuant to committee rules, need to ask if you would stand and please take the oath. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? May the record reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Thank you. And with that, we will recognize Mrs. Tregoning for her opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairman Gowdy, Congresswoman Norton, Congressman Davis, members and staff of the subcommittee. I'm Harriet Tregoning. I'm the Director of the D.C. Office of Planning. Thank you very much for this opportunity to appear before your subcommittee on behalf of Mayor Vincent C. Gray in support of modest proposed changes to the 1910 Federal Height Act. As you may know, rooftop structures, as Congresswoman Norton mentioned, are already permitted under the Height Act. While allowed, these roof structures have been limited in their use to mechanical equipment, elevator overrides, building mechanicals, and are currently prohibited from any use that qualifies as human occupancy, like a recreational room or an office space. Allowing their use for more active purposes will have no real impact on the overall maximum height of buildings as permitted by the 1910 Act and will not impact the district's recognizable and historic skyline. The Height Act has been a defining element in creating the city's skyline and has resulted in an iconic form in our nation's capital. I believe that the District of Columbia will always limit the height of buildings, whatever the fate of a Federal Height Act. This relationship between the width of streets and the height of buildings is a very important one. But let me underscore something that Congresswoman Norton said, that there's nothing particularly sacred about the numbers that were selected, the width of the street plus 10 feet for residential streets, the width plus 20 for commercial streets. Rather, that there's a notion and a relationship between the height of the buildings and the scale of the street. So it gives you something that's human and pedestrian scaled and is relatively unique among cities. In fact, on Pennsylvania Avenue, which as the presidential inaugural route is one of the most symbolic streets a public avenue anywhere in the country, it actually already hosts buildings of 160 feet, and many of those have on top of the 160 feet additional roof structures. And the additional 30 feet is not particularly noticeable, and that's within the Federal city. This human-scaled city that's been created through an intimate relationship between the width of streets and boulevards and the corresponding heights of buildings on those streets is a more walkable, I think, more beautiful, more unique place as a result. Allowing other uses of rooftop structures wouldn't change any of that. The Act has created great views and vistas that are underscored by the city's wonderful topography. Restricting the use of roof structures to purely mechanical purposes actually forbids people's enjoyment of some of the city's greatest spaces and most striking views. These views and these amazing spaces might also be among the city's most valuable, given their scarcity and their largely unobstructed vistas. With almost 40% of the district's land tax-exempt or otherwise off our city's tax rolls, this is an opportunity to increase the tax base and our fiscal stability by allowing this building area to be occupied with no impact on land, height, or neighborhood character. I will note that a Federal action to amend the Hyde Act will need to be followed by local action to consider amendments to the district zoning code to allow such a change in use, with all the public notice and public input that such an action would entail. While not prejudging the outcome of the process, at the local level, we do urge your support of a Federal action to permit use of roof structures for other than mechanical purposes, which would then allow the home rule and self-governance determinations of the District of Columbia to proceed. In conclusion, I respectfully ask for your support for this modest proposal to change the Hyde Act, one that has the potential to substantially enhance the District of Columbia's tax base while continuing to respect the city's existing horizontal and human scale. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Gandhi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Gowdy, Ms. Norton, Mr. Davis, and members of the subcommittee. I am Natavaram M. Gandhi, Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia Government, and I am pleased to be here for the committee's hearings on the proposed changes to the Congressional Heights of Buildings Act of 1910, the so-called Heights Act. The District of Columbia is a dynamic and growing city. Since 1996, despite 2 recessions, the district's population increased by 8% by adding 46,000 residents. In 2011, the district added more than 1,000 residents per month, the greatest annual increase in D.C.'s population since 1946. From April 2010 to July 2011, the 2.7% percentage growth in population was 3 times the U.S. population growth rate, and the district was among the top gaining large U.S. cities. Yet, our potential for growth is nowhere near exhausted. At 618,000 residents, we are still considerably short of our 750,000 population level in early 1970s. Since 1996, the district's economy has grown significantly. Jobs located in the city increased by 112,100, or about 18%, and the average personal income of D.C. residents now stands at $73,105, or 175% of national average. This growth has been accompanied by a strong expansion in construction. In 2011, the district had 7.5% more apartment units and 26.6% more commercial office space than in 2001. Over 8,000 residential units are currently under construction. With a small footprint of 46 square miles, the district already commands the 2nd highest commercial office rental rates in the nation and has only 4.7% vacancy rate for Class A apartments. The district's limited real property base is further constrained by height and density restrictions, which pose a risk to the city's ability to accommodate further growth in population and jobs. Today, in my testimony, I would like to focus on 3 points. First, the federal legislation that eases the city's building height restriction is necessary, but not sufficient to expand building capacity beyond what is currently allowed in the District of Columbia. Amendment to the city's zoning regulations must accompany such federal legislation. Second, while relaxing or eliminating height and density restrictions could eventually have positive financial implications on the city's future tax revenues, the policy is especially important for the city's continued growth. By allowing the district support more residential units and office space, this change would afford more flexibility to the district in accommodating growing jobs and population. To be clear, changes in the height and density restrictions could increase the value of the real property tax base, which accounts for over $1.8 billion in annual tax revenues. But these increases would also be tempered by local property tax relief policies, such as residential and commercial property tax caps. Third, real property tax revenues are ultimately determined by economic factors such as number of jobs, office rents, and household incomes, which may or may not be immediately affected by changes in the height limits. Accordingly, the realization of higher taxes from increased density will take time, especially given the slow recovery from the Great Recession and the underlying economic uncertainty. Additionally, we are facing the possibility of federal automatic spending cuts, known as a sequestration, totaling $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years, beginning January 1st, 2013, for the district, where federal spending is around 60% of the city's gross domestic product. Federal cutbacks could drastically slow job and income growth in the district. Within the congressional parameters, it is the district's zoning commission, with significant input from residents, that sets the specific building heights and density restriction for every building. Even the few federally initiated exceptions to the height restriction, such as Basilica and the old post office of Pavilion, were followed by enabling amendment to city's zoning regulation. Given the extensive public hearings that characterize the zoning commission's operations, the rezoning process can be long and contentious. It is only after these complementary legislative and administrative changes are fully implemented that the District of Columbia could realize the full benefit of the changes to this land use policy that has been in place over 100 years. While the policy change would be historic, the immediate effects of this change may be small. The assessors will recognize that the market response may be slow, especially in parts of the city, such as downtown area, where the buildings are already fully leased at relatively high prices, and the developers would likely delay rebuilding until factors other than the zoning rules, such as the condition of building, become relevant. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, despite these uncertainties, elimination of the height and density restrictions on the district's already limited real property base could be an important step towards maintaining the city's long-term ability to accommodate further growth in population and jobs. This proposal would allow the city more flexibility in its future growth path, and we look forward to working with you on this matter. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Costa.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Norton and Mr. Davis. My name is Marcelo Costa. I'm the Executive Director of the National Capital Planning Commission. I'm very pleased today to take this opportunity to speak with you about NCPC's perspective on the Height of Buildings Act of 1910. As you know, as you described today, the Height Act regulates the maximum height of buildings in the District of Columbia, and its limits are generally based on a relationship of the building to the width of the street in which it is located. And we also talked today a little bit about some of the other functional requirements of building, which allow them to project above the maximum heights, including penthouses, spires, domes, and other unoccupied rooftop structures. And as also discussed today, within the framework of the Hyde Act, the District of Columbia zoning regulations also guide heights. These zoning regulations, which respond to local planning objectives, are often more restrictive than the Hyde Act itself. The Hyde Act is now over 100 years old, and its impact on Washington's urban form and economy has been the subject of much public debate over the years. NCPC supports preserving the overall building limits established in the Hyde Act because of its extraordinary contributions to the city's distinctive character, particularly the area known as the L'Enfant City. However, as the Hyde Act's regulations also affect a building's functional elements, consideration of certain technical adjustments may be appropriate. Adjusting prescribed locations of mechanical equipment or rooftop structures may be necessary to accommodate contemporary building technology or new environmental measures that improve a building's efficiency. However, even such technical adjustments to the law may have impacts on the character of the capital city, and we urge cautious review of any modifications. Although fire safety was a central factor in the Hyde Act's enactment, its legacy is a uniquely appropriate character that suits the city's role as a national capital. This character includes broad sunlit streets, carefully framed parks and memorials, and a city skyline that is not defined by commercial skyscrapers, but important national civic monuments and landmarks such as the Capitol Building and the Washington Monument that are important to the American people. Major changes to the Hyde Act could have profound consequences for these civic and design qualities in Washington's most historic settings, including the L'Enfant City. Increasing building heights in district neighborhoods and communities beyond the L'Enfant cities may have less impact on the character of the Federal establishment. However, these changes should also be assessed for the impacts on Washington's distinctive skyline, residential neighborhoods, and their adjacent business districts. Allowing tall private buildings directly along the edge outside of the L'Enfant city and around what's known as a topographic bowl could degrade the public character of Washington's skyline. If technical changes are not carefully crafted, what may seem to be minor modifications to the Hyde Act could have unintended consequences for the urban design of the city. For example, the Hyde Act, along with the District of Columbia zoning regulations, regulates the number and placement of mechanical structures and penthouse on building roofs. These structures often house elevator equipment and heating, ventilation, and cooling systems. While usually not critical to the overall design and appearance of a building, these structures can also be seen from public spaces, from the streets, and also appear, these could also appear from the skyline if they're not properly placed or set back. Hence, any tweaks to the regulations of such penthouses should be mindful of the potential impacts these structures could have on the city's character. In addition to urban design consideration, we also believe that the Hyde Act has provided unique economic opportunity to the District of Columbia. The Hyde Act has kept new development from being concentrated in a few extraordinarily tall buildings and allowed real estate activity to be spread throughout the city. For example, areas north of Massachusetts Avenue, such as NOMA, the Yards, which is M Street along near the Navy Yards and U.S. Department of Transportation headquarters, have emerged as new business districts in recent years and also have benefited from the dispersal of development activity that the Hyde Act has helped create. Despite the restrictions established in the Hyde Act and the zoning regulations, the District of Columbia possesses developable land that could accommodate new growth. Through the Federal and District of Columbia Government Real Estate Property Act of 2006, the Federal Government has also provided opportunities for the District of Columbia to develop Federal lands at Poplar Point and Reservation 13 for private taxable development. There were other examples, including the Southeast Federal Center, which is known as the Yards, and portions of the Armed Forces Retirement Home, which the Federal Government is working with the private sector to develop, as well as the Walter Reed Army Medical Center and St. Elizabeth's East Campus, which are other former Federal facilities. And we do believe that these projects will provide the District with additional opportunities to increase the tax base without requiring major alterations of the Hyde Act. Finally, security does play a fundamental role in how we plan and develop Federal buildings and their settings. In the past, the Federal security community has expressed some concerns about proposed increases in heights in areas adjacent to sensitive buildings such as the U.S. Capitol and the White House. So any discussions about the Hyde Act changes should be done in consultation with security officials, including GSA, the U.S. Capitol Police, the U.S. Park Police, Secret Service, Architect of the Capitol, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense. Our Commission is comprised of both Federal and District members, and we are in a capable position to lead a study of any Hyde Act alterations that the Committee may want to pursue. We do thank you for inviting us to give our views today. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lewis.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members and staff of the subcommittee. My name is Roger K. Lewis, and I thank you for inviting me to address this subcommittee. I'm a practicing architect, urban designer, and professor emeritus of architecture at the University of Maryland. Since 1984, I have written the Washington Post's Shaping the City column, and since 2007, I have been a regular guest on WAMU-FM's Kojo Namdi radio show, in both of these venues we have frequently talked about height limits. I believe that some modifications of the 1910 statute with appropriate zoning changes in carefully chosen areas are needed and should be considered. In America, building height limits were based initially on 4 considerations. 1, recognizing firefighting, structural, and other technical constraints. 2, ensuring adequate light, air, ventilation, and views desirable for public streets, civic spaces, and abutting private properties. 3, respecting historically prevalent building heights in established neighborhoods that preexisted zoning. And 4, and finally, and most important, making necessary aesthetic value judgments about urban design and architectural form. Yet inevitably, height limits are arbitrary. For example, why 90 feet rather than 85 or 95 feet? In fact, there are no formulas or universal standards for exactly setting height limits. In the District of Columbia since 1910, these considerations have constituted the basis for stipulating and maintaining height limits. Thanks to these historic limits, the nation's capital has remained a uniquely memorable low- and mid-rise city. From many places in the city, views of America's most iconic, symbolically significant structures have been preserved because downtown skyscrapers cannot be erected. Yet, there are places in the District of Columbia, I believe, where height limits established decades ago are today inappropriate and unnecessarily constraining, a reflection of outdated planning and zoning practices. These practices were characterized most notably by designation of large areas, land use zones, limited to predominantly one use and uniform height limits. Broad brush, one-size-fits-all planning and zoning failed to take into account locational variations in topography, solar orientation, views and vistas, proximity to parks, adjacency to civic open spaces, and infrastructure, present and future, especially transit. It did not differentiate, for example, between mid-block properties and properties at corners of major intersections. Today's city planning, urban design, and architectural principles and techniques are far more sophisticated and effective. Broad brush strategies of the past are obsolete. We now can engage in fine-grained planning, urban design, and zoning. We can identify, analyze, and designate specific areas and sites in the city where increased building height and density make great sense aesthetically, environmentally, functionally, socially, and economically. This smart growth approach can enhance the city's urban and architectural qualities while yielding fiscal benefits for the city, as has already been pointed out. Furthermore, inactive as an incentive bonus overlaying existing zoning in appropriate locations, increased building height limits and density can engender development of much-needed affordable housing. Where should height limits change? In the downtown L'Enfant plan area of the district, including traditional residential neighborhoods, height limits should remain substantially unchanged to preserve the center city's dominant character and skyline. But there are specific sites, such as the Southwest and Anacostia River waterfronts, where upward adjustments of height limits would be beneficial without jeopardizing the city's historic profile. Outside the L'Enfant plan area, many sites could be suitable for higher buildings, especially near metro stations and major roadways. Most important, the only equitable, professionally responsible method for identifying places to raise height limits and for determining height limits is to create a detailed citywide plan prior to any rezoning based on a rigorous comprehensive study. This is essential to avoid piecemeal property-by-property relaxation of height limits through variances, exceptions, and ad hoc rezonings, a process too often influenced by political and financial pressures. Because municipal and federal interests are involved, the building height study and plan should be prepared collaboratively and transparently by the D.C. Office of Planning and the National Capital Planning Commission. Many Washingtonians are apprehensive when anyone suggests modifying D.C. height limits. They envision Rosslyn-like skyscrapers rising all over town, ruining the capital's historic image. Some believe that raising D.C. height limits anywhere would set precedents, invariably opening the proverbial barn door to greedy developers in league with corrupt politicians, enabling high-rise buildings throughout the city. But skeptical citizens need to understand that through fine-grained urban design, prudent legislation, and precisely targeted, well-enforced land use regulation, the barn door will not and cannot be thrown open. Therefore, in conclusion, revising D.C. height limits requires not only a credible citywide planning effort, but also an ongoing public education effort to help citizens recognize that legislation adopted over a century ago can be improved. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Collins.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gowdy and members of the subcommittee.
I may.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gowdy and members of the subcommittee. I am Christopher Collins. I'm testifying today as counsel to the District of Columbia Building Industry Association. You have a copy of my full testimony, which I will summarize. The 1910 Height Act has specific requirements for in Section 5, which are the subject of our discussion today. That section is the one that limits the height to 130 feet generally on a business street and 90 feet on a residence street, minus 10 feet actually. Above the maximum height of a building itself, Section 5 of the Act allows two additional types of structures. Number one, architectural embellishments, and number two, roof structures, which in the 1910 Height Act are listed as penthouses over elevator shafts, ventilation shafts, chimneys, smokestacks, and fire sprinkler tanks. With the advent of central heating, ventilation, and air conditioning in multi-story buildings, this equipment is now placed on the roof as the modern version of ventilation shafts, chimneys, and smokestacks. Congress set no limitation on the height of architectural elements, and they can be located anywhere on the roof of a building. Likewise, Congress set no limit on the height of roof structures, except that they must be set back from the exterior walls of a building a distance equal to their height above the roof, and they are prohibited from being used for human occupancy. D.C. BIA believes that the horizontal nature of our city skyline is an important component of the city's beauty and special character. We also understand that there are a wide variety of views on the wisdom and importance of the 1910 Height Act and whether the established height limits should be retained or modified. D.C. BIA has examined this issue, and we believe that there is a practical approach for a minor change in the Act that would have absolutely no impact upon the skyline of the city as currently permitted by the Act. Simply stated, as previously mentioned by others, that is to remove the restriction on human occupancy above the top story of a building. Allowing habitable space in a roof structure, in addition to the normal rooftop machinery, while retaining the current roof structure setback requirements, would allow a wide variety of uses such as restaurants and lounges, health clubs, community rooms, enclosed swimming pools, and other residential and non-residential uses. Allowing such use of roof structure space would also likely promote a greater use of rooftops outside of these roof structures for active and passive outdoor recreation and rooftop landscaping. We believe that this proposal will have a positive benefit on the quality of life for those using those facilities and will also help to enhance the beauty of the skyline of our horizontal city. I have attached to my testimony an article which provides more detail on this proposal. On behalf of D.C. BIA, I thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Richards.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gowdy and members of the subcommittee. I'm Laura Richards, appearing on behalf of the Committee of 100 on the Federal City. For 90 years, the committee has worked to safeguard and advance Washington's historic distinction, natural beauty, and livability. We appreciate the opportunity to testify on the important issue of building heights in the city. We emphasize 2 points. First, the Height Act of 1910 plays a positive, powerful role in shaping the cityscape and the experience of living in D.C. Second, it is not necessary to change the Height Act in order to achieve additional residential capacity or to stimulate economic development. The Height Act shapes national and local D.C. As international planner Larry Beasley said during the Act Centennial, the height limit allows the national symbols of the Capitol to stand out and prevail over all other massing of the city, and brings into focus the dramatic dome of the Capitol and the spire of the Washington Monument. But the Act is not just about expressing national power. It is about the joyful pleasure of walking down a gently scaled street, of unexpectedly coming upon a magnificent public edifice. It is about the frantic life of our modern world being made more bearable. Beasley's enthusiasm is shared by residents across the city. Our Capitol stands as the identifying focus for the country as a whole and our commitment to freedom as a society. Its unique history, physical design, and aesthetic character are integral parts of that essential role. The Committee of 100 therefore objects to proposed changes. One idea under discussion would allow space surrounding rooftop mechanical penthouses to be used for residential, commercial, or other purposes. Penthouses are excluded when a building's height is measured. They are ancillary features whose impact is minimized as much as possible by setbacks. Building height should be determined by neighborhood context and zone purposes. Letting the penthouse drive height decisions puts the cart before the horse. Also, during task force meetings held in conjunction with the city's rewrite of its zoning rules, pools and party rooms were often mentioned as desirable uses of roof space. And are these amenities a sufficient reason to disturb the Height Act? Some proponents for higher buildings agree that Height Act limitations should apply to the central monumental core, but urge that higher buildings should be allowed elsewhere. This would sever the physical unity between national Washington and local Washington to the detriment of both. The monumental core derives its impact from the fact that it is dominant. Surrounding it with a ring of high-rises can result in the Disneyfication of our national icons. A separate proposal to create a single high-rise sector, as Paris has done, presents a different negative outcome. Most sites mentioned as candidates for such a sector are east of the Anacostia River, possibly Poplar Point. Creating a high-rise sector east of the river would result in displacement of a significant part of Washington's African-American community, again, and would further exacerbate the city's racial divide. Washington can grow its economy and house its residents without raising the height limit. Indeed, the Height Act has been credited with driving some of the development that has occurred outside the central city, NOMA, for example, and with attracting foreign real estate investors because buildings are likely to hold their value. The city overall is experiencing sustained growth. On a day several months ago, 32 cranes were in the air. In addition to visible construction activity, there is a growing small business sector led by the two fastest-growing population groups, young singles and empty nesters. Notwithstanding these favorable trends, there is persistent double-digit structural unemployment east of the Anacostia River. Structural unemployment is a problem that must be solved, but raising the height limit is not the answer. Since the 1970s, the district has seen successive development booms, but none of these waves, none, led to meaningful short-term or long-term employment opportunities directly or indirectly for African-American residents, especially those east of the river. Any suggestion that raising the height limit is a cure for structural unemployment is wishful thinking at best and disingenuous at worst. As to housing, the city's own numbers indicate that the housing supply does not need a boost from raising the height limit. In 2001, the city adopted Alice Rivlin's proposal to grow Washington by 100,000 new residents over the next 10 years. To accommodate this increase, the city designated large tracts for intensive residential development and another 30,000 smaller sites for 120,000 new residents total. We've now got 46,000 new residents, and we haven't developed most of those sites. There's a shortage of acceptable affordable housing, but that's not really a good way to raising the height limit won't accommodate that, because that's the most expensive housing to build. And I think my time's up, so I will conclude with just to be cautious. As Beasley said, be very careful as you gamble with the 100-year-old legacy of the Height Act. Take care not to open up things too casually. I dare say that those height limits may be the single most powerful thing that has made this city so amazingly fulfilling. Thank you.
I want to thank all our witnesses for your opening statements and especially for your adherence to our time limits that even sometimes we don't always adhere to. So thank you. With that, I am going to stand down on my questions and recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia and allow her to go first if she would like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me go first to the technical questions. Have any of you, perhaps Mr. Lewis, Mr. Collins, there may be others of you, Mr. Tregoning, any of you, looked at the technical questions of the feasibility of occupancy of the present space and where the existing mechanical equipment would go? Would it share that space? Could it go elsewhere, Mr. Lewis?
No.
Oh, sorry. The answer is that the reason there are mechanical penthouses, not just to accommodate elevators, but all the mechanical equipment on the roofs of buildings, is driven largely by the fact that much of the basement space that you could build under buildings is used for parking. And from a design and constructional point of view, the penthouse, the mechanical penthouse on the roofs of buildings is very, very commonplace in this city, particularly with the type of construction that we have. If the roof, if that additional level, I think it's approximately 17 feet that we're allowed for a penthouse, if that becomes occupied space, mechanical equipment then has to go somewhere, and it takes up, I should say, a lot of space. The equipment is not just a 10% occupancy of the roofscape. That probably the only place you could put it, if you don't put it up on the roof, is somewhere, again, down in a basement, which then takes away from space for parking and creates some other problems that have to do with running ductwork and so forth. So there is a trade-off, and it's, again, I don't think there's just one way to do it, but there are pressures that put mechanical equipment on the roofs of buildings.
So a developer, Mr. Collins, would have to consider whether he wins or loses by adding space one place in a city where parking is at a premium, if he'd have to take it from parking.
Well, I don't think that you would have to move the rooftop equipment elsewhere in all instances. I think that this proposal to use roof structures for habitable space would work best in larger footprint buildings. Smaller buildings, infill buildings, mid-block buildings may not work. There's a certain amount of the mechanical equipment that must be up there. If you have an elevator that is pulled from the top, you've got to have your elevator penthouse on the roof. If you have access to the roof by stairways or elevators, you need to have that space as well. A lot of the mechanical equipment for buildings must be air cooled, so that has to be, it works most efficiently on the roof. It can be elsewhere, but then it has to be cooled. So you will always have a certain amount of the roof structure equipment on the roof, and given this, the larger the building footprint is, the more usable, occupiable, habitable space you will have on a rooftop. It won't work in all instances.
Mr. Tregoning raises the interesting notion that occupying that space could actually add to the vistas. It's interesting because many of us go to the parts of the city where there is a vista in order to get a vista, because the city does not have as many natural vistas as some large cities does. So she says it could add to the vistas, and Ms. Richards says it could create some kind of pockmark of some buildings with and some without. So to try to reconcile these two views, how would that be different from most cities today, where some buildings are tall and some buildings are not as tall? And so are you saying it would mar the view from heights to have some buildings with, some buildings without?
It's going to depend on the street wall of a particular street, and we're talking now about raising the height act to do this, not the zoning regulations. So to the extent that you need to raise the amend the height act to accommodate this, you're talking about buildings that are already at their natural height, their maximum height.
Or new buildings that could be built to that new height.
If you're going to build a new building, you can accommodate these desired kind of roof structures by simply putting them, at the existing height level, and just do a trade-off. It's really only going to affect existing buildings that are at their maximum height.
Well, Mr. Collins, do you believe that some developers would want to add to their, or Mr. Lewis, to add to their existing buildings? Would there be some kind of incentive to do that?
Well, there have been instances in the district in a different context where owners have added on to their buildings in certain parts of downtown that are designated as receiving zones in the downtown development district, where developers have added 3 and 4 stories on top of existing buildings because they hadn't
reached their height limit.
Well, because there's two height limits in the district. There's the 1910 Height Act, the absolute limit, and then there's zoning, which is sometimes less, and many times it's less. But in the downtown development district, which Ms. Trigoni may want to explain in more detail, there are, in exchange for providing certain amenities and benefits in the downtown area, residential, theaters, different types of uses, retail, you get bonus density which can be transferred to areas surrounding the downtown. And that has been done in some instances, and it's been done very successfully. So it may not be financially feasible in all instances, and it may not be financially feasible, especially if the building is not structurally loaded, to add 3 or 4 more floors. But it has been done. To get directly to your question, I would think that what may happen is on some larger footprint buildings where there is a roof structure that may be set back a greater amount than is required. There may be more space used on the roof by the roof structure if it's able to be used for habitable purposes. There are certain instances that I'm aware of in the district where the technology has resulted in the mechanical equipment on the roof being downsized to such an extent that there's a vast amount of unused space in the roof structure that might be able to be used, for instance, for a health club or for a community room or something of that nature that is going vacant because of this limitation.
My time is up. I'd like to come back after everyone has an opportunity.
Yes, ma'am. With that, I would recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Gandhi, is there economic impact to be realized should the height be increased?
Yes, sir. Eventually, there will be economic impact in terms of expanding our tax base. We do have a fundamental problem of having a very limited, narrow tax base in the district. As it is very well known, but I must reiterate that roughly 2/3 of our income is not taxed in the city. We have, of every $100 that are earned in the city, we get to tax only $34. $66 are taxed in Maryland and Virginia, roughly. It's like going to a restaurant. We would say that of all the people who are eating here, 1/3 will pay, 2/3 will not pay, and everyone would complain about bad food and bad service. Similarly, roughly 40% of our commercial real property values are tax exempt. So what we have here, a problem, is of a limited tax base. Indeed, only 2 of the 13 largest employers pay our taxes, real property taxes. And only 1 of the largest 13 employers pay our business taxes. So we do have a problem of a very limited tax base. And eventually, what this will do is to accommodate a growing population and most likely increase our tax base.
Mr. Lewis, how do you balance the aesthetic value of the buildings, the property, the city, and at the same time realize the opportunity to expand the tax base a bit?
Well, that's a very good question, but it's also the question that almost every jurisdiction I've worked in asks, because it's invariably an unavoidable dilemma. Growth, if you accept the notion that growth is inevitable, that there will be growth, people will want to live here, then the question arises, where do you accommodate the growth? My fear about a lot of the discourse we're hearing of, let's say, allowing some of the buildings to go up 1 more story is not addressing that issue at all. It's a tweak, frankly. I think, and tweaking, in fact, I would argue as being an architect and urban designer that adding another 15 feet to a number of the buildings won't significantly change the character, the profile of the District of Columbia's downtown or its historic areas. I think that what I'm proposing is, in fact, an answer to your question, which is that I think I'm worried about our dying this death by 1,000 cuts. That we'll come in and we'll add a story here or a story there. That it won't add up to anything when it's all done, or that might add up to something quite negative. That's why I have advocated that to answer the question, we really need to look at the whole city. I believe there are places in this city, many of them quite distant from the monumental core, by the way, where taller buildings and not skyscrapers. I really want to correct the impression that many people in the city have that when we talk about lifting the height limits, they shouldn't be envisioning Chicago or New York or Roslyn. I mean, we're talking about maybe allowing buildings, instead of being 90 feet, allowing them to be 140 feet or 150 feet. Even that is still at some point is an arbitrary value judgment that must be made. I believe that a lot of what we're talking about is about value judgment. That is, what is the right balance? How do we find the balance between accommodating growth in a prudent and aesthetically appropriate way while preserving the historic aesthetic qualities of the city as a whole? And I think that can be done. It's been done in many other cities. It's in districts and areas, not necessarily for the whole city. In this case, in the District of Columbia's case, I think the only prudent way to do this, as I said in my testimony, is to look at the city comprehensively and identify places. Let me give you an example. McMillan Reservoir. Here is a place where, next to the Washington Hospital Center, where there's a tremendous sentiment on the part of the community to make a lot of that space park. It would be very easy to accommodate some of the density that I think the city would like to see there by allowing slightly higher buildings facing Michigan Avenue or along North Capitol Street. I mean, that's what I was talking about earlier when I said there are places that should be targeted well outside of the monumental core, a long way from downtown, where, again, buildings, instead of being 60 or 90 feet high, might go to 120 or 140 feet. I don't advocate, by the way, that we start building 30 and 40-story buildings, which is what we have in Roslyn.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, if I may comment on what Mr. Lewis is saying, yes, every jurisdiction does have a problem of limited tax base, but nowhere would you see the problem as severe as in the district. For example, I used to have an office on the 11th floor of the Judiciary Square building when we had the City Hall there. I look outside and museums, monuments, galleries, beautiful, nothing I could tax. And ultimately, when you have a large chunk of our commercial real property tax exempt, for a variety of reasons, you really have to wonder, where do we get enough resources, enough tax base to take care of the city's needs?
Dr. Gandhi, I am reluctant to use the phrase "trust me" because I went to law school, but I am going to give you a chance when I'm questioning to go into exactly what you were just alluding to. It is now my pleasure to recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California who has joined us, and recognize him, Chairman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for being in another hearing. Dr. Gandhi, you're one of my heroes in town. A lot of people around here trust the fact that you get your numbers right, that we can count on you to be an honest broker. Isn't, though, part of the revenue of the city, the green space, that untaxed space that is in abundance in the District of Columbia?
Yes, sir.
And if we're looking at trying to make the District of Columbia a success, we're going to obviously preserve the mall, the space, and so on. But you also, on occasions like myself, I'm sure, drive up to Northeast, don't you?
Yes, sir.
Do you notice that you drive far longer up into Northeast before you leave the district than it would take for you to get over the river to some of those 30 and 40-story buildings that represent considerable revenue? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So is there any city in America in which its state prohibits a city from self-determination of that 30 or 40-story building when there are 30 or 40-story buildings closer? They're simply in another city.
I understand your point, sir.
I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Lewis, that's one of my questions, and I think for Ms. Richards too. Today's hearing is primarily on the small step, the baby step, the deliberate incremental step of simply asking whether a building is more aesthetically pleasing, modern, and acceptable to the best practices by having an elevator shaft and a bunch of air conditioning conduits on its roof, or whether a rim of similar or slightly different offices, meeting rooms, or whatever on the top floor with no visible mechanicals, which one is more appropriate for a 21st century city to the extent that you have these buildings? Mr. Lewis?
There's no question that I think most people would agree looking up at the top of a building and seeing it meeting the sky with occupied space is better than seeing it meet the sky with penthouses and mechanical equipment. I mean, I think I sit on the design review board in Alexandria, where we have been dealing with this for 20 years in the development of Carlisle, and we have very specific design guidelines for penthouses for just that reason. We don't the people in Alexandria don't want to see the penthouses, and if they do see them, they want them finished with something other than fake stucco. So I have to agree completely that
or plastic trees.
Whatever, yeah. Exactly. On the other hand, I'd also be the first to tell you, since I'm an architect, that half the battle is having a good architect. I mean, I think that one of the
my lawyer says a good lawyer is good too.
One of the challenges in D.C. has a lot to do with the proportions of buildings. When you talk to architects practicing in Chicago or New York, or for that matter, Frankfurt, Germany, they're baffled. You know, they can't understand why we have this phobia about going a little bit higher or going much higher. I don't advocate going a whole lot higher, but I do think one does drive around D.C. or walk around D.C. and certainly can't help noticing a lot of the buildings that have been built, commercial in other words, are not exactly architectural award winners. So that's a long answer to your short question. I do think that
so in the short answer, getting rid of ugly appliance floors and replacing them with approved by the city, local control, letting them decide what aesthetically fits on existing buildings with an existing height cap that currently gets to the top floor, and it's sort of basically it's pipes and shafts rather than a rim of hopefully the most aesthetically pleasing top to a roof. The short answer is yes. If we were to support that and ultimately the city would decide, that would be good for the economic base, it would be good for the aesthetics, and it would have absolutely no change in the maximum height of a building in the District of Columbia.
Well, no, I think it's reasonable, but I think you should recognize there will be great pressure from many buildings, particularly as Mr. Collins pointed out, small footprint buildings. There will still be pressure to put things on the roof. I mean, I'm quite convinced.
Well, I live up in Northwest when I'm in the district. I'm very aware that every home in the district, and Ms. Richards, I haven't started on an opportunity for you to answer, so I want to be, if I can have the time, make sure you get fully heard. Some of the most desirable and ugly things there are homes like the one I live in, but mine doesn't happen to have it, in which we all find a way to put a balcony there, or we put some wood and a terrace, because we all want to sit up on our roof at least on those few days that are just perfect. We all understand the desire, but currently we have a moratorium. We have a limit, and that limit induces, if you will, the crown of a building to be less desirable rather than inducing or encouraging it to be as aesthetically pleasing as possible, particularly in a day in which the mechanicals of buildings are getting smaller and smaller in modern buildings or remanufactured buildings. Ms. Richards, since I've been told that you're somebody who, more than anyone else on the panel, has dedicated yourself to trying to preserve much of what we have in the District of Columbia, as a closing, you can answer any of the questions that others did, but aren't we best off preserving as much of, if you will, old Washington and the homes and some of these buildings, and maintaining our concentration in K Street and those areas, make them as pretty as they are, but recognize that the buildings we're talking about are not buildings built in the turn of the last century. They were built in the last half of the last century and so on. Wouldn't you agree that we could make them prettier, even if we're talking about no change in the top height? And separately, if there's a second round, I would like to talk about the possibility that there be taller buildings outside of just that first step. Ms. Richards.
First, speaking solely to the penthouse issue, yes, it's a highly desirable thing that mechanical penthouses have become smaller and smaller. And there are ways to deal with them to make them more attractive and the roofs more attractive, short of turning them into like other kinds of spaces. For instance, there's a building on the new city buildings on 4th Street have created kind of like decorative features around their mechanical penthouses, not just the little kind of like little boxy structures that you see. Or even
So you're for them still being only mechanical,
yes,
but being less ugly?
Less ugly, and also there's a new green roof initiative in the city, so you can do marvelous things with green roofs that will provide greater masking and not the plastic pots. So I think that, yes, we've had to tolerate roof structures because, as an exception to the Height Act, because they were necessary, like a smokestack was necessary. But now that we can find ways to either mask them or minimize them, this means that we can really more fully comply with the Height Act. And so that is how we, the Committee of 100, would recommend addressing this.
Thank you. Hopefully there will be a second round.
Yes, sir, there will. And I will recognize myself for 5 minutes, and then with the indulgence of our panelists, because we have such an eclectic amalgamation of expertise, we would like to go to a second round if your time permits. Dr. Gandhi, I'm going to pick on you because, as Chairman Issa said, I have known you in the past. You have always given me thorough, accurate, fair information, and with that comes consequences. So I'm going to ask you, give me your 3 best pieces of evidence. You're the prosecutor. You want to get the Height Act amended. What are your 3 best pieces of evidence to amend it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kind comment, and also Chairman Issa. I am here not to advocate what Congress or the elected leaders should do about height limitation. All I'm suggesting here, as my role as a Chief Financial Officer, is to realize that we do have a limited tax base, a very constrained, narrow, limited tax base. At the same time, we are a city with great needs of infrastructure, of the human needs, and at some point, federal government has to recognize the city's issues here. We are very proud to have federal government in our midst. We are nation's capital. But at the same time, with the federal government comes the burden of the federal government. So it's a mixed bag to some extent. So I would not recommend either way. It is not my duty. My duty here is to give you the numbers, as you pointed out, sir, and be as honest in numbers that I gave you.
As you know, and as many other members of this panel are, I'm a big fan of your chief of police. So I like to think, how will her life be impacted? More residents, more service needs to be provided. Have you done any analysis of how your fire department would be impacted, your public safety, transportation?
No, we have not done that work ourselves.
You were in response to a question maybe from Chairman Issa, maybe from Mr. Davis, talking about the lack of a tax base, and I wanted to make sure that you had as much time as you wanted to answer that. There are unique challenges. The mayor of my hometown, former Mayor Bill Barnett, we have universities and churches in downtown Spartanburg so we have the same issue but on a much smaller scale. So go ahead and finish the answer to the extent you wanted to.
And thank you very much for your kind comments and also the time that you are affording me. District of Columbia is the only place in this country where the income is not taxed at the source, where it is earned. That is the problem that we face in the city. Second, we do not have a state to take care of the city. All central cities of America are subsidized by their states via suburbs. Our problem here is that our suburbs here are subsidizing Maryland, that is to say Baltimore, and Richmond, not district. And that is the fundamental problem we have. I think what we need here is a tax base that is enough to take care of profound needs that we have in the city. 1/3 of the city is Medicaid eligible. 1/3. West of the park, we have among the richest people in the country, but east of the river, we have among the poorest census tracts in the country. That is a fundamental problem. We have to take care of our people. And for that, you need a tax base. And as I pointed out, that being a seat of the nation's capital, it gives us a great advantage in terms of our economic activity. And indeed, it is not 32 cranes. We have 42 cranes out there in terms of economic development ongoing, and it's a great tribute to our elected leadership that makes it possible, and Ms. Tregonig. But at the end of the day, I have to balance the budget. We have to have tax revenue to take care of the needs of our people, and when we don't have enough revenue, that is a problem. And if I may just take one more moment, that is why we had a profound problem on our infrastructure. Schools, parks, recreation, library, technology. Thanks to the great help that we received from federal government, we were able to take care of some of that problem over the last 10 years. But what we need here is a recurring, continuing, predictable help in our budget.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi. My time has expended, so I will now recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia for round 2, and then go to the gentleman from California, Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lewis, I was interested that you indicated in your testimony, I'm looking, it's the page that's not numbered. You discuss what you call the downtown L'Enfant Plan area of the district. And you say that those areas should remain substantially unchanged. Then you say, but there are specific sites, and you cite the Southwest and the Anacostia waterfronts where there might be upward adjustment that would be beneficial without jeopardizing the city's profile. I'm interested in both those areas. With the assistance of the chairman, we've just gotten out a major bill here to develop entirely the Southwest waterfront. That's going to amount to a brand new community in the District of Columbia. That's going to mean that if you take a bill that I got out of the Congress 10 years ago on the Southeast waterfront, that the city is going to have a continuous, extraordinary 21st century waterfront with communities, with mixed use, extraordinary new revenue to the city. What interests me, though, in your citing of these waterfronts is you seem to see them as outside of the monumental core. Each is only a few blocks from the most precious monuments. One is not perhaps so precious on the east side. It's a few blocks from the Capitol. But on the southwest side, it's a few blocks from the monument and all of the historic buildings. So I was interested that you chose those two areas where you thought one could raise the height limit. Why wouldn't that be, I mean, would that be any different from, who is it, the testimony of Mr. Acosta that warns allowing tall private buildings along the edges outside of L'Enfant City and around what's known as the topographic pole could degrade the public character of Washington's skyline. So I'm trying to reconcile those two views.
Let me, first of all, clarify this. My comment about those waterfront sites, which are just examples, those are in fact sites in the L'Enfant Plan area. And if you read, I don't switch to outside that until the following sentence. And the reason I mention them has a lot to do with topography. When you're on the waterfront, you're down near elevation 0, and if you move 5 or 6 or 8 blocks toward the center of the city, you might be up at an elevation that's a good 20 or 30, 40 feet. That's why I mentioned topography as one of the many variables that could be factored in here. No, I cited those as places where, because they are waterfronts, they're very desirable, high-value real estate with wonderful views. That's a place where you're adjacent to a huge amount of open space. It's one of the logical
on one
places.
side. On the other side, coming into the city or looking back into the city, what about those views? Will those views be interrupted?
Well, those views, if you've got 40-foot-high row houses, which you have to the north of the waterfront, I know the site very well. Once you build a building that's 50 or 60 feet tall, nowhere near the height limit that we're going to in fact apply on the waterfront, the views ultimately are determined by the spacing of buildings horizontally. This is just urban design 101. So to the person living, if you will, uphill, a little farther away from the waterfront, what affects that person's viewscape is not the height of the buildings. It's actually the spacing of the buildings and the streetscape and the public realm that we.
Well, then I have to ask Mr. Acosta what he meant about when he said tall private buildings along the edges of L'Enfant City and the so-called topographical bowl. Is that what you mean? Are you and Mr. Lewis talking about the same?
They're somewhat different areas of the city. When we talk about the topographic bowl, if you think of where the St. Elizabeth campus is and where they're building the Coast Guard headquarters, that is on the topographic bowl. And GSA, when they developed that building and designed it, they took great care making sure that it followed the contours of the landscape and didn't project out. When we're talking about the edge of the topographic bowl, right on it, on the edge itself, you do find landmarks like the National Cathedral, the Basilica, and other images there. So I think the question there is, you have to be careful when you insert another building within that realm. And there may be areas beyond that which you wouldn't see from the L'Enfant City itself that may be more appropriate for higher rise sort of development. So as Mr. Lewis said, you do have to do a very fine-grained urban design analysis and be very careful and very thoughtful in terms of where you place these things in order to protect the landscape and the surrounding setting of the L'Enfant City. And I do think those are the sort of things that we would look at. But I do think when we review projects and from the Federal Government side as we construct these projects, we do take great care in terms of making sure these things fit in appropriately into the design of the city.
Mr. Coney, D.C. has its own Lower Height Act. I'm trying to figure out why and how that figures into this discussion.
We don't have a height act per se, but you're right that some of our zoning certainly does not allow buildings to be built to the maximum height allowed by the Height Act, and that might be because the buildings in different parts of the city are actually already at a very much lower scale. So to allow a 90-foot building or a 130-foot building next to a 50-foot row house wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. But there are certainly parts of the city, especially the parts that have great transit access, where that could be accommodated. And I might actually differ a little bit with Mr. Lewis. I will point again to Pennsylvania Avenue at 160 feet, which is certainly in the core of Washington, and yet it's not a noticeably injurious height. So I would think that there are parts of the city along K Street and other places where, in fact, it might make sense to look at higher limits, especially for a purpose. Dr. Gandhi talked about the tax base, but I would also argue that beyond the broad tax base. We have parts of the city that don't enjoy some of the same liveliness and livability as other parts because they might be only office enclaves and have no residential. And because these parts of the city might already be fully built out, there's not much of an opportunity to add that residential component in much of the downtown, whereas on the east and west ends of downtown, where they have residential, it's very different, very much more mix of uses, very lively. So the opportunity to potentially add a little bit more height in parts of the city that are very much in demand might actually create the opportunity to do things like fund metro and other transit and provide additional housing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm past my time.
Thank the gentlelady from the district. The chair would now recognize the chairman of the full committee, gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Norton, I didn't think you were past your time at all. I thought that you were on a roll. I'm happy to let you continue with the line of questioning, so I'll try to do that. Ms. Tregoning, if I hear correctly, and I think I'm hearing it from most of the folks that are witnesses here today, the arbitrariness of the Height Act is, in fact, just that. It's arbitrary. There are places in which it is too high for the best interest of the city. There are places where we're already above that height in other ways by our own decision. And there are places in which adding to it could be an economic boon to the city. We heard geographically or topographically that, in fact, in some places you've got a reason down by the waterfront to do one thing, where up in the Heights you have something else. And my example of in Northeast, far from the mall, you really have a whole different world. It may not induce people wanting to go that high, but the arbitrariness of the limit really is just that, arbitrary. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I think you heard actually from every single panelist that there's an enormous value to the city of having a limit to the height, of having a relatively pedestrian-scaled city, a human-scaled city, and I don't think any one of us is advocating getting rid of that, except maybe Dr. Gandhi.
He's not advocating anything. He's just counting the money.
Exactly.
That's my job, sir.
Yes, sir.
But that being said, there is nothing magic about those particular numbers, and that in some case, we would love the ability to figure out what is the most appropriate thing in particular instances, and in some cases perhaps go higher than what the height limit allows. But I think for the most part, much of the city would have no changes whatsoever, and any changes that would be made would be things that we determine with our citizens about what's appropriate.
Well, Mr. Acosta, I'm going to go to you and say, if Congress wanted to modernize how we view the District of Columbia, both from a standpoint of local control, but also to Mr. Lewis and other people's desire to do the best in architecture, if we were, as an act of Congress, to open up the Act, make it possible for a commission, a joint commission, to go through the process, to do the planning, to ask the questions of what areas for perpetuity should be one way, while other areas that could be opened up to at least application for amendments to a master plan versus areas that could be immediately modified, and then have it come back through a joint process for approval of Congress. Would that at a minimum be a sensible thing to launch the basic, ask the question of, are there people who can produce a better master plan for the city if we empower that master plan to be considered favorably by Congress? Just that sort of question. I'm not defining the specifics, but I'm saying, should Congress look at passing a law that would empower local authority in concert with national figures to do a better job?
I think this is a great conversation because I think it is about the future of the city, both from a national perspective as well as a local perspective. Let me take first the federal interest issues with respect to the Hyde Act. I think although the Hyde Act wasn't necessarily was constructed because of symbolic reasons, and as we've gone through the presentations, it was really for public safety reasons, I do think one of our issues here from a federal standpoint is stewardship over the L'Enfant City. And if you kind of even go back into the history of this, it's really a notion of these symbols like the Capitol, the Washington Monument, were really the notion, were from our founding fathers, essentially.
They intended on the Capitol Dome looking down on the White House with appropriate disdain, and a lot of construction has made that impossible. So I'm acutely aware that you cannot look from the Speaker's balcony and see the President and look down on him as the founding fathers clearly intended.
There is some truth to that, but I also believe that from a layout standpoint, from the designs of the streets where they've selected where prominent buildings should be located, like this is on a hill, the Washington Monument should be a significantly tall building or a structure in the city. I think that was all intentional, and that from a stewardship standpoint, I think that is our role, to ensure that those national symbols remain very prominent in the skyline, and that also is affected by the setting. And I think the issue here is because of the Hyde Act for 2 centuries, that setting has been consistent, that we've seen a low-scaled city. It has allowed these very prominent symbols of civic architecture that are very important to our American people to be prominently displayed. So I think the one issue here is, as we're going through this discussion, is really where do you draw that boundary? And we've heard different opinions about where those could be. I mean, whether it's a few feet away or in the entire city. I think that is the core question in terms of where we draw that Federal interest boundaries. I also think that, as Mr. Lewis explained today, you do have to do very detailed, fine-grained urban design analysis, and as a way to consider where these taller buildings could be appropriate. And that will take effort. That will take a lot of conversations between both Federal stakeholders and, I think more importantly, with the local community, because essentially what we have today is a prevailing height. And people are very used and they're very comfortable with that today. And any changes to that, and we've seen debates in communities, 1 story may be too much. And I think those are the sort of issues that, especially on the district side, that they will have to deal with as they're going through this. I think I have great respect for my counterparts at the Office of Planning at the city, and I think if Congress would like us to think through a process to do this, I think we'll be happy to work with you and the city to do so.
Well, thank you. I come from a business background where if you don't have a strategic plan, then you don't have a plan. And I would question today, over all the years that we've had an arbitrary height limit, has it served us well? Perhaps, but it served us without a plan. And so one of the reasons that Ms. Norton and I think, took interest in reviewing this is, what if we said, let's make a master plan and see if it would be better than what we have today? Perhaps Ms. Richards, looking at heights that are variable and for a purpose, could find that they would be better. Certainly, I happen to know, as a resident during weekdays here in the district, that everybody wants the home next to theirs to not be taller than theirs. But few object to theirs being taller than their neighbors. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. The Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Middle Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Acosta, Mr. Lewis, Mr. Collins, are the structures designed in such a way that retrofitting could not necessarily easily, but accomplish the goals that Dr. Gandhi sort of articulated and indicated?
Well, that's a structural engineering question, which I'll try and answer. I mean, that varies from building to building. There are some buildings in which the structure could accommodate some additional stories. We know we've seen some buildings downtown in which 2 or 3 more stories have been added. We also know that there are a lot of buildings in the District of Columbia that do not reach the height limit that's allowed. There are ways of sistering on structural members to allow for buildings to be expanded. I would point out also that one of the virtues of taking an existing building and keeping it and expanding it is that it's a very green strategy from a sustainability point of view, because all the resources that have been invested in that building are being saved. And I mean, there are a lot of moving parts to this. that's why I would say what Congressman Issa proposed in the question to Mr. Acosta, I think is exactly the right thing that we need to do. I have great fear that if we don't have the master plan, if we don't have the strategic plan, which after all is a plan not just for us and the voters of today, we're talking about planning for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. That's what planning is about. It seems to me that it would be irresponsible not to ask the District of Columbia and the Federal interest to in fact develop the strategic plan. And I think I've answered not just the question you've asked, but the answer is that a lot of the buildings can be expanded one way or the other. There are some that are not worth saving, and you demolish those, but that's, again, a case-by-case basis.
Mr. Davis, as your question about the aesthetics of that, yes, that can be achieved. There are, I'm thinking along K Street, the western part of the downtown, where K Street is, there's probably half a dozen buildings which have had additional stories put on. But also you see the phenomenon around the city of reskinning a building, taking it down to just the slab, taking the walls off, taking the systems out and rebuilding, essentially, but saving the slabs and adding on top. So that is happening around the city as well. So yes, it can be achieved.
Mr. Cornyn, let me just ask you from a planning, zoning perspective, would you anticipate a tremendous amount of zoning anxiety as individuals would prepare to make further or different use of structures, and how that's going to affect their neighbors and others who might be pretty close proximity?
I think there would be a combination of zoning anxiety and zoning euphoria, yes. I think that you would have both depending on the interests. But just like the vast majority of the city comes nowhere near the limits of height, I think we would want to say right off the bat that the vast majority of the city, particularly the residential areas of the city, would be unaffected by these changes, and we'd be looking to probably do something more surgical than blanket in terms of any changes that might be proposed, and like I say, probably for a purpose. I would also say that even a small step like the penthouse occupancy that we've been talking about would probably result in more beautiful rooftops and more enjoyment by people of the wonderful skyline of Washington. If you've been on a rooftop in Washington, and there are many places where you can be on the roof, it is a wonderful experience with tremendous views. And if they were much more routinely used by people, the entire roof, not just the mechanical penthouse, would probably become more garden-like and more beautiful, because that's what people would expect to see if they were, as opposed to black tar paper or something like that on the top of a building.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
I thank the gentleman.
Yes, thank you. If I may, I wanted to respond to your comment on the arbitrary nature of the HIDE Act and the absence of planning. And I would say that there has been a good deal of planning. The district just revised its comprehensive plan extensively in the last 2.5 years, and that was a multi-year process. And pursuant to that, the city has been undertaking since, I think before, the last 4 years, a major revision of its zoning regulations, and that is approaching completion. And that did entail substantial inquiry into how heights of buildings are measured. And there are some proposed changes to the regulations that address, in a very fine-grained manner, the operation of the HIDE Act. All of this has happened within the context of the existing HIDE Act. As everyone has noted, there is a substantial capacity within the HIDE Act envelope for increased height and density. And I would say that from a citizen's perspective, there is substantial opposition to even building up to the existing height limit. I'm thinking now of a very aggressive opposition to adding a 4th story to a new building in historic Anacostia. It's at 3 stories. I'm also thinking of a building that was proposed to be built to 7 stories at Pennsylvania and Minnesota Avenue. And the residents fought, and it's now going to be 5 stories. Examples abound. I'm sure you're familiar with the Upper Wisconsin Avenue debate. The residents there finally were able to keep the existing heights. And all of these are struggles that have existed within the Height Act envelope. There is no real public sentiment among the residents for going high. People want a horizontal city. So I would urge you to take that into account, and also to say that there is a good deal of planning that has been going on. Yes. So I just would hope you would take that into account.
Mr. Chairman, if I could have the indulgence to ask the ranking member something on the record.
You may have all of the time that I was about to give myself to use in whatever fashion you would like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Eleanor, you more than anyone else here on the dais feel the pulse of the city. I think Ms. Richards certainly is probably right that there is a great deal of opposition. The question before us today that I hope we're working on is, should we empower the city to answer some of those questions itself, and would they appreciate the opportunity even if they decide not to use an amendment to the Height Act?
Mr. Chairman, this is an important question because I treat it as a home rule question. Do you trust the city? And by the way, developers don't come to the Congress with this stuff. We know what developers can do in the District of Columbia. That said, the district has, and I pay my respects here to Mr. Tregoning, has shown an extraordinarily expert and sensitive way to plan for what has been the most extraordinary expansion of the city in many decades, I think before I was born. I certainly trust the city and its citizens. As Ms. Richards says, you don't play with citizens. You may have every reason to want a few stories, but you will bring down the citizens on you and like nothing you've ever seen. They don't have any power except the power of their residency and numbers. So I think the city would be hard-pressed to refuse to accept the ability to responsibly handle its own Height Act decisions, particularly in light of the fact that through zoning, the district apparently has already lowered heights well below anything the Congress had in mind. Mr. Chairman, the Chairman tends to think through solutions as he hears testimony. I think it's a laudable, you kind of read his mind as he's thinking. I think it's a laudable process for members of Congress to go through. He said, for example, in trying to think of how this would work, that you could still have Congress somewhat involved by some sort of joint process, and the district could have, who knows the city best, would have more to say about heights instead of all of the discretion resting in the Congress. I just want to suggest, Mr. Chairman, that as you were speaking, I thought about our own zoning process, which has federal officials sitting right with local officials. So in effect, and there's a great wisdom to this process, instead of having the federal government fight the city and the city fight the federal government, they've got to figure it out together because officials, important officials, representing the Federal Government already sit as a part of the planning process. When you consider that that already happens, it seems to me we may already have the mechanism to assure that the Federal Government is involved in the right way without going to elected officials in the city or in the Congress. So I think the question you ask is a truly pregnant one that the city would have to consider, particularly when you said that watch out, the chairman is from private business and very successfully, so he talks about a strategic plan. Well, that's far more difficult, of course, when you're thinking about this entire city and what it's meant. Nevertheless, I think that, particularly in light, I think of Mr. Lewis's caution that you better watch out about hit and miss stabs at what to do with the city. So one would have some vision, a vision that the city hasn't had any reason to even try to get, since it hasn't been within its jurisdiction. I would think that no opportunity could be more important than the opportunity to have the city look at the whole city. I cannot, I didn't envision that as we sat here, but I must say that I certainly agree with you. Now, Mr. Chairman, if I may say so, I don't know who is responsible. I don't know if it was you, but some member of the panel. It may have been Mr. Lewis himself, the architect, who criticized the architecture of this city. If you want to know what most disturbs me about this city, I've never seen such pedestrian architecture in my life. If you go to other cities and you see this wonderful architecture, I wonder if I'm just looking at height and the variation that brings, or if the way in which the Height Act, particularly in downtown and Monumental Core, has been seen by architects and by people putting up buildings where many of our federal structures are, have said, just let me put up a box. And it seems not to have drawn the most creative instincts from architecture. We see some of it in the city as I speak in the new libraries. I am flabbergasted. I invite you all to look at some of the new libraries where architects, not having anything to do with federal structures or federal buildings or housing federal buildings, have come up with the most extraordinary buildings I have ever seen anywhere, seeming to challenge the downtown to look more like it can be, like it is the work of architects, rather than people who've just thrown up some buildings in order to make sure they can get a lease for some federal workers. I would like to, in light of the chairman's question, because if the city were to get this larger authority, I wonder if what we see in the libraries, in the new public buildings, in the schools even, wonderfully new, different looking, I think prize-winning buildings, whether that would affect the architecture of the city so as to improve the architecture of the city if the city had more what the chairman sees as more responsibility, rather than authority, more responsibility. Or is the look of these structures, except for the historic buildings, interestingly enough, which seem to be more creative, but the use of these structures that began to develop, I don't know, in the 40s and 50s, whether that was a function of the Height Act, or if not, why in the world does downtown architecture look so undistinguished, and is the authority that the chairman spoke of relevant to thinking through a different look for downtown, even with the Height Act?
I thank the gentlelady, and I will make you one other pledge. Not only can we work together on the Height Act proposal, but for Mr. Gandhi's pleasure, I think we should, after the election, start thinking about how we're going to deal with the only place that doesn't have the ability to tax people who earn their income in that place, a separate subject that Dr. Gandhi referred to only in passing. With that, I yield back and thank the Chairman.
Well, with that, on behalf of Chairman Issa and all of us on this subcommittee, I want to thank our witnesses for your expertise, for your collegiality, comedy, not only towards us on the committee, but particularly with one another. It's been a very educational hearing and a delight to be part of. I was thinking as Ms. Holmes Norton, Mr. Davis, and Chairman Issa were talking, this is a magnificent, beautiful city. It's home to a lot of people, but it's a national treasure to every single one of us that live in this country. So,
Mr. Chairman, could I just say one thing? The Chairman in this hearing has just opened up a new idea to come from this hearing in the very same way that he did when, after listening to you, Mr. Gandhi, and the Mayor, city officials, and his own witnesses, he literally, after that testimony, did something almost comparable to what he's done this evening. He said he was for budget autonomy for the District of Columbia, and he and I are working together as I speak to try to bring the city budget autonomy. I thank you for that as well, Mr. Chairman.
with that, our hearing is adjourned. Thank you.